Hi everyone, it's Ed, and I'm excited to be here today doing a question and answer about how to talk with your spouse about money. This week I've been asking the community at large about what are those money dilemmas that you get stuck in with your partner that are hard to move forward. And there's been some different themes that have shown up, and so I'm really excited to talk about them today. We're going to talk about prenuptials is one of those questions that I had. We're going to talk about approaching debt conversations with your partner. We're going to talk about approaching um, large purchases with your partner. Um, we're going to talk about engagement and merging your financial life together. Uh, I think that those will probably be more than enough for today. But if you have something that you want to share, go ahead and type it in and ask the questions. And I look forward to trying to help you out. So let's get rolling. This week, the topic of prenuptials came up. And when I'm working with my clients, what I like to do is talk with them about the two sides of prenuptials. On the first side of a prenuptial is the legal aspect, right? A prenuptial is a legal agreement or document shared between two people that are entering into a marital relationship. Now, I got to tell you a little backstory here. When my wife and I were going to get married, she brought up the issue of prenuptials, and let's just say I wasn't real excited about it. I didn't understand a lot at that point in time about prenuptials. I wasn't a financial planner at that point, I wasn't a therapist. So I didn't think deeply about it. I just reacted pretty negatively to it and protested against it. And she acquiesced on it. But years have gone by, and this issue of a prenuptial has come back up for us, and some of the hurt feelings about the way that I handled it or mishandled it. Um, I've had certainly a number of clients come in, and they are really stuck about the fact that a prenuptial got signed in their relationship. So we know that a prenuptial is a legal agreement between two parties, and it's effectively trying to protect the assets that one person has before they enter the marriage with another person. And at a very practical level, that makes a lot of sense, especially if you're someone that has some accumulated assets or some family wealth, which is where the prenuptial often comes into place. Is either you've had a professional career where you've accumulated a certain amount of assets, or you have some family wealth that you're trying to protect. And the way that a prenuptial gets structured is varied. Ultimately, you have to work with, or you want to work with, an attorney, not a financial planner or a therapist, but an attorney that knows all the intricacies of this. Well, that's well and fine if we just look at it from a practical perspective, a legal documentation perspective. But there's this whole other element that we need to also consider when we're thinking about prenuptial agreements in partnerships, and that's the psychological piece. And within the psychological piece of a prenuptial agreement, there's multiple pieces that we need to be thinking about. One of the first parts that we want to be thinking about is the meaning of the prenuptial. The next part is we want to think about the emotions behind it. The third part is really the thoughts behind it. And really, kind of psychologically, we want to think about the practical outcomes of this, what happens when we sign a prenuptial agreement. So, first on the meaning, right? Well, for a lot of people, unfortunately or fortunately, when they're asked to sign a prenuptial agreement, it's they interpret it as you don't trust me to be here with you in the long term. That's the meaning that I see a lot of clients give to a prenuptial when they're asked to sign it. And that's somewhat understandable because it is an agreement that basically says if this marriage doesn't work out, here's what I get to do contractually. And so some really interpret this as a kind of planning to fail. Now, this does make sense in the broader culture and reality. We know not all marriages are going to make it. And as humans, we're somewhat risk adverse. We don't want to bear all the risk. And so we use this legal document to protect us against some of that risk. But psychologically, when we enter a romantic relationship, we're not thinking always about that. That part of our brain is asking for more of an all in. I get all of you. I get to be with all of you. We get to share our resources mutually together. And the prenuptial then becomes like a wedge between the two people, blocking their ability to do that. Right. Now, let's go down another layer in this. When psychologically we're asking for a prenuptial, oftentimes the person that's asking for it is feeling a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, oftentimes some shame and anger, because it may not even be them that's asking directly for the prenuptial agreement. Sometimes it can be a family member who's telling their child, if you're going to marry this person, you need to have them sign a prenuptial agreement. And this creates a really difficult relational bind for the person that has to go to their significant other and say, my dad, my mom, my parents, my grandparents are um, expecting me to have you sign this prenuptial agreement. And now they feel this loyalty bind. There's no easy answers to this, but we really want to be able to name that process is informed by some relational risk and they are feeling bound. Okay. So we've got this kind of the meaning of it, the emotions, the relationals, the thoughts behind it. I want to feel protected. I need to be taken care of. This seems like the rational and practical thing to do. But the prenuptial psychologically enters in a lot of complexity for the relationship. So if you're in that point in your relationship where you haven't entered the marriage, but there's talk of the prenuptial agreement, my encouragement is to really go slowly through this process, to recognize and be curious about your own feelings about the prenuptial agreement, whether you're the one requesting it or the one being asked to sign it, to recognize that the meaning and the final decision on whether to do a prenuptial or not to do a prenuptial agreement is going to have some long-term implications. One of the things I like to try to encourage my couples towards is, if you're focused on developing relational health and security, the need for the prenuptial agreement will go down significantly. Now, that might seem idealistic or overly hopeful depending on where you're at relationally right now. And so, certainly, please don't take this as hard advice to do a prenuptial or to not do one, but to know that it's going to have both legal and psychological implications. And we need to be able to explore both sides of that. All right, so that's on the prenuptial side of things. Now, another question that I've had come up this week is, how do I approach my partner around debt? And I see this a lot of times. And I think the knee jerk response or automatic thought is, well, we've got to just take the debt, we got to get it paid down, we got to structure a plan and get it paid off. And in some cases, that might work, but probably not. There's probably other things that need to happen when there's been debt built up in your intimate relationship. Your hesitancy to ask your partner about the debt is often likely warranted in experiences of your partner reacting in adverse ways. So they've gotten angry at you, they've gotten accusing towards you, they've gotten critical towards you, they've gotten sad, they get overly anxious, right? All these emotional responses are difficult to navigate, and they may be serving as a barrier to moving more deeply into that conversation that requires actually a vulnerability and curiosity and empathy and, yes, even some concern. But when we start to talk about entering into approaching our debt, we're really also entering a conversation about how are we going to change our life. And that brings in a lot more questions where we're going to have to change some of our patterns of thought and behavior in ways that we experience our life. And that can feel really challenging. So when we can reframe the how do we approach the debt conversation and the amount of debt that's building up, we want to move from this perspective of being antagonistic and critical or fearful and anxious to holding a position of empathy, curiosity, kindness, understanding. That's the first level. The second level is also understanding that for many clients that I've worked with, there's some family history around spending and debt that informs the way that they think about the money now. And so we may have to work on bridging between how we're feeling about it now with how we're feeling about the debt from the past. So this is again where we can use really powerful reflective questions from a non-judgmental and very curious place. Is I wonder how your parents managed debt. What was that like for you, honey or sweetheart, when your mom would spend so much money and your dad would get upset with her about the credit card debt or the spending? What was that like for you when your dad took out that business loan that ended up not working out and your mom now had to go and work a second job? Right? We know that our partners have had these experiences around money, but what we often don't know is the deeper layers of meaning that they've given to them. And sometimes our partners don't even know the deeper level meaning that they give into it. And so we have to psychologically be able to start working through this material so that we can increase our own level of reflectivity and flexibility around how we face our finances. Oftentimes, when we're stuck with some amount of debt as a pattern in our life that we can't get paid down, there are things that need to change for us psychologically before we can make forward progress financially. And if we just try to change the financial reality, we're going to inevitably hit up against our psychological realities. So that's where being able to enter into a collaborative process with your partner and reorienting your mindset and how you're going to tackle this is going to help you move further forward on your journey. Now, this is not always easy to do, but it can happen and it does take time to make that happen. So the debt also can hold its own meaning, much like a prenuptial agreement. Everything in the money world holds meanings. We're meaning making creatures. So if you're struggling in debt, you're also likely struggling with some amount of shame. Right? Shame is that very difficult feeling of unworthiness, not good enough, not smart enough. And when we're stuck in that state of shame, we feel very relationally isolated. And so, a big part of tackling our debt with our partner is about restoring our relationship with our partner, also. Oftentimes, before we're able to tackle the debt, we've got to also work on our relationship with our partner and with ourselves. This is easier said than done, but when we take the time to become relational and more securely attached, that's something that, I love to talk about is our attachment styles. But when we can learn our attachment styles and what it means to have a secure attachment, all of a sudden the relational skills and processes that we have change. And so as we change the way that we relate to our partner, new opportunities open up for the way that we experience the debt. But if we can start with recognizing if we're struggling in debt, it's a lot like people that are struggling with their weight and self image. We have a financial self image, just like we have a body self image, right? So we don't always want to look in the financial mirror, so to speak. We don't want to step on the financial scale, so to speak. And so being able to recognize that you're not in this alone, that you may need to reach out for professional help with someone like myself or another financial therapist, uh, can take you a long ways in going forward. So, what else do we need to think about when we're approaching debt? Well, we also want to get out of this fight, flight, freeze response. Our autonomic nervous system lends us to perceive debt as highly threatening. And when we perceive anything as highly threatening, we're going to be less clear headed about what's happening and how to make decisions. So we've got to work on helping to regulate our emotional arousal that says, this is scary, this is overwhelming, to deep breath, this is a lot to deal with. I may not have all the solutions yet, but I can find my way forward to new solutions, new ideas about how to resolve this debt, especially if I can do this with my partner. Okay, so that's a lot to think about with our debt. It has a lot more to do with the psychology behind what's happening with the debt. Certainly, this is going to take some time and some skill to get there. It's not an overnight fix. So, but when we can remember that shame is at play, that we have a financial self image, that we can feel lost and scared, that we have our autonomic nervous system, that fight, flight, freeze system that's working. We want to work on creating security. I can remember actually, I'm thinking about this, uh, a, a client, and really multiple clients, but there's one in mind that I'm thinking about, that they talked about their credit card debt. And after they told me what their number was and where they were in the parking lot, and they had maxed their limit, and they were just so overwhelmed, and they were telling me this story of, and just the tears were pouring down. I responded very differently than what they expected. They expected me to be critical and to be harsh and to punish them and to kind of wave my finger and say, well, you know better, you shouldn't be doing that. And instead I said, wow, I imagine that was really overwhelming for you. That was heavy. That was scared. You don't know how you're going to get this debt paid down. And they took a deep breath, and that deep breath was a breath of acknowledgement and relief. But as we talked about it more, what they went on to describe is, I really am expecting you still to be critical of me. And they said, well, where does that come from? And they then connected it back to having grown up in a home environment where their parents were very critical of them in many of their decisions making, not just around money, but grades and their physical appearance and the way they interacted with their siblings. I mean, basically, there was just nothing that this person could do right in their family, at least as they experienced it. And so those types of experiences from our childhood are what I would get called chronic shame, where our sense of self is so lowered. And when I'm working with my clients around debt, I often see that there's a correlation or strong connection between early childhood shame and rejection and higher levels of debt. And so this is difficult material to work into, but we want to start bridging that gap between how your childhood experiences formed your sense of self, how well that's left you equipped to face these financial challenges and to start working through the emotional triggers. Because often also with this debt, there's, much like in the world of eating, emotional triggers. We use spending to soothe ourselves, to regulate ourselves emotionally, to feel come back into connection with something. And this is where we get into relating more with objects oftentimes as a source of comfort instead of people. But when we've experienced people as threatening and non-soothing, objects become a natural replacement as humans. I mean, just think about it, right? Little kids, they use an inanimate object, their lovey, their favorite little stuffed animal, and they give it a lot of meaning and a sense of comfort. They're doing that as a bridge away from their parents when their parents are not able to be there for them relationally. So as humans, it's very natural and understandable that we use the objective world, the object world, to create a sense of security and safety. And we want to be able to do that. We want to be able to buy jackets and shirts and shoes and home environments to provide a sense of safety, security, community. The problem is when we do that in excess or in the absence of ability to connect actually relationally with people, we lose that balance. And so these are deeper layers of complexity when we're thinking about, why am I in debt? Well, it's not just that you're stupid. It's not just that you're lazy. You're in debt for often very complex reasons that are meeting unmet emotional and relational needs. So we've got to be able to tap into that. All right, so let's shift off the debt topic. We've talked about a couple of really heavy things. We've talked about prenups. We've talked about debt. But let's talk now about how to talk with your partner about a big purchase. And I love this topic. It's one where I get stuck all the time. And, you know, I don't have the magic key, but I do have a set of keys that helps me work through this, because it's really, when we're talking about wanting to buy a big thing, it impacts our partner as much as it impacts us. And so why does this get sideways for us in our couple relationship? And I think, you know, I'm always prone to look through that attachment lens, which helps for me at least, explain that as humans, we want to and need to be bonded and connected with our partners. That's a primary human need. And that when we feel safe and secure and accepted in our partner, we're free to also dream and collaborate and explore and be curious. That's what the secure attachment and psychology says is when we feel securely bonded, we can go out into our environment and be curious and explore and enjoy, and then turn back and come back and share that. So when we're talking about wanting to make big purchases, we're really talking about oftentimes an expression of ourself, how we see ourselves in the world, where we want to be seeing ourselves in the world. And yes, certainly I know that we can be buying big purchases beyond what we maybe are appropriate. Certainly there's a part of us psychologically that we can have big fantasies, sometimes even grandiose fantasies that take us beyond the limits of what we're capable of now. That can And so we can be individually in the state of excitement and curiosity and wanting to go for something bigger beyond our scope. But in that, it evokes a very different response in our partner if they're not able to see it through that lens. If they hold more of the financial responsibility in the family, they can feel that the weight of you wanting to make that big purchase literally on their shoulders. I couldn't tell you how many times I've heard that. Is they want to be the financially responsible partner. You may be more of the dreamer, little less worried about the pragmatics of making a big purchase. You also may be very practical about making big purchases and not want to approach your partner about it because of, again, we come back to this fear of rejection, right? That's the relational anxiety. That's the relational anxiety, especially that shows up in insecure, anxious, and insecure avoidant attachment patterns where there's an internal fears around rejection and the way that those get managed. So when we're wanting to make these big purchase decisions, we want to remember that it represents likely one thing to me and something different to my partner. Now, this is again the word of the day is curiosity. We've got to get curious about what does this really actually represent to my partner, because it probably doesn't represent one thing, but it represents a multitude of things. It may represent threat, responsibility, burden, resentment, jealousy, and excitement, all in there, right? Because I wish as humans we would just have one reaction or one feeling about something like a big topic, like, I don't know, buying a lake house or a boat or going on a big trip or what's that big purchase for you is also somewhat relative and subjective. And that's part of the fun and challenge of this being collaborative with your partner about even being able to define what is a big purchase. Have you stopped and had that conversation with your partner about what's a big purchase? How much is too much? I was literally just this morning talking with someone about signing up for their exercise program. It seems like a really good fit for where I'm at and what I'm wanting to accomplish. And, when you get in that sales cycle and they get you all excited about it, it's like, yeah, I want to do this. I'm excited. And then just before I said, yeah, let's do this, I realized, you know what? This is above my wife and I's financial threshold for spending without talking to each other. And fortunately, the other person was very, very professional. And I said, look, I do need to go talk to my wife. I think she'll be on board, but it's better for me to check with her first, then make the decision instead of what I have done in the past, which is make the big purchase and then come back and explain why I want it. And now she's feeling kind of backdoored or pressured into this big purchase. It's not really the best way to do it. It takes a little more risk maybe on the front end, but to be honest and vulnerable with my wife about what I want to purchase. So big purchases, what we want to remember is it takes relational skill. I mean, I think that's a theme for all of these topics. It takes relational skills of curiosity, of empathy, of patience, at a deeper level, emotional regulation. We want to recognize that these big purchases have symbolic meaning or value to our partner. And if we're quick to be critical or judgmental or dismissive of these, in time our partner is likely to withdraw or pull away from telling us about these big purchases. And they may just go off and do it on their own, right? So one of those patterns that we've got to be watchful for as an intimate partner is, do I do things overtly or unintentionally that shut my partner down from expressing their big dreams? I've certainly worked with countless couples where one person is the dreamer and the other person is more the pragmatist. And this is an ongoing dynamic for them where they need some help. And what I find is for the person that's more the pragmatist, they learn through their childhood that having hopes and dreams, expectations for the future was often disappointing. Um, Thinking about one client in particular, they grew up with a father who was an alcoholic, and anybody that has grown up with a parent that's an alcoholic kind of already knows this. But the environment becomes so much less predictable, and the it's having the expectations for something good happening often get missed. And so part of the adaptation psychologically is to shut down having the hopes and dreams. So on the restorative journey is starting to recognize or differentiate that those were childhood experiences, but that may not be true now. And it's safe to start to dream and to have expectations met. And it may be needing to start out smaller before you go bigger. So pressuring your partner to have big dreams and hopes and expectations, probably not the right approach. We probably want to reframe it. We want to invite them into being able to have the desire for bigger purchases, which are an outcome of having bigger hopes and dreams. Okay. All right. So in the last few minutes before I go, what I want to talk about is um, engagement and time to get married. And this kind of backdoors around to our first topic of prenuptials, right? I certainly have worked with a number of couples where there's some anxiety about getting engaged, about blending the finances. So let's pick one of those topics that's really challenging is yours, mine, and ours. And couples have quite a variety of ways that they try to organize that. But I think if you're struggling to negotiate that, the yours, mine, and ours, or how we're going to manage those finances, let's let that be a signal that there's something deeper experientially that we need to know and understand before we can decide on the right plan to merge our finances together. For many of my clients on this journey, they've watched parents go through pretty bitter divorces where money was a very contentious topic. And that's left them with a lot of anxiety about bringing their financial world together with another person. So being able to name that and start to explore how watching your parents fight over money and what that felt like for you as a child may be leaving you now with some of your own financial anxiety. One thing that I like to have couples do in this scenario is just even to start to give frame to this financial anxiety. We can have them scale it from 1 to 10. 1 being very little or no financial anxiety about blending your financial life, and 10 being the highest or unmanageable. When we can start to frame our financial anxiety for ourselves and for our partner, it starts to help us know where we're at and maybe what we need to do differently or the same. So, getting engaged, blending your financial lives together is very challenging, especially, I mean, just for people that have never been married. But if you're listening to this and you've been married and now you're entering your second marriage, there's multiple more layers that we need to be able to work through. So, giving yourself the time and patience to explore and be curious and to provide empathy to walk through these difficult conversations will help you get off on the right foot a lot faster. All right. Well, I think that answers most of the questions that I've gotten this week. I look forward to getting more questions. Certainly feel free to mention them, ask me, direct message me on LinkedIn, on Instagram, on Facebook. And also, if you haven't had a chance, go to healthyloveandmoney.com and take the attachment style quiz where you can learn what your attachment style is and how that applies to your financial life. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope that you have a great rest of your week.